and it's a question and answer period. And so otherwise it'll make it much easier for Andrew to speak and not have any kind of background ambient noise. All right, so we are recording at this time. I'm going to introduce Andrew Camp. Well, first, let me introduce myself. My name is Jeff Whitman. I'm the director of Prevent Child Abuse Indiana, and it is our privilege to have you here today and learning with us. Our presenter this morning is Andrew Campbell. Um, Andrew, a little bit about Andrew, and he can tell you more during his presentation about himself. But Andrew is an expert on family violence and the associated risks of harm for adults, children, and pets residing in homes where violence occurs. Andrew obtained his master's degree in public health from Purdue and has presented at over 175 professional conferences and trainings just since 2019, so he's a busy man. His many publications over the last several years include papers cited by the FBI, CDC, which is Center for Disease Control, United Nations, and over 1,300 international academic papers and research studies. His book, Not Without My Pet, Understanding the Relationship Between Victims and Domestic Violence and Their Pets, was released in September of 2021. In addition to being an author and researcher and educator, Andrew also speaks as a survivor of family violence in childhood. So we are thankful to have Andrew here, his vast amount of experience and expertise to share with us today. And at this time, I'm going to pass it on to Andrew Campbell to give us great information over the next 2 hours. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, if you're talking, you're on mute.
All right, now we should be hearing me. Everybody hearing me now?
Yes, thank you.
All right, sorry about that. Here we go. All right, now you should be seeing. Okay. Well, I was just saying thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you all this morning. This topic is one I feel very passionately about, as I do really all the topics I speak on. I have about maybe 15 different unique presentations on family violence that I routinely give. And obviously, I really can't imagine talking about family violence and not talking about emotional maltreatment. Obviously, any act of family violence, really in any context, is obviously going to be emotionally harmful. Today, we're really just going to lock in on that topic of emotional maltreatment and emotional harm. I'm going to talk kind of at the start, maybe a little bit just in general about emotional maltreatment. And then we're going to really focus a lot today on the aspect, again, of children who reside in a home where family violence is occurring, most often speaking about partner abuse, and the emotional harm that occurs from living and residing in that environment. Often, unfortunately, this harm is extensive. So again, I appreciate your time and attention today. I always bring more information than I can cover, regardless of what kind of time slot. If I'm speaking for 6 hours or 15 minutes, as I was asked to do last year, which was actually really hard at a conference, and you can barely even get started on these topics in 15 minutes. But even in 6 hours, I find myself running out of time. So I always bring more slides than I can get to. And the purpose there is that I can share that with you, even if we don't cover it. So I'll make sure my PDF of all of my slides is available to you, so that you can even review some of the slides if there's not time to get to those. I'll also share a couple of my studies on this topic, which I'll note throughout the presentation and make sure those are available to you as well. So without anything further, I think we'll go ahead and jump in today. Again, I've got plenty of content today. I will try to stop, though, at the end to allow some time for questions. In person, I like to make it a little more interactive where we can kind of stop as I'm going. But in this format, I think it sometimes works better for me to be able to just get through as many slides as I can, and then save time there at the end for questions. If you have a question, I know it's hard sometimes to remember, so go ahead and jot it down in the chat box, if you would, and then we'll get to those at the very end as we have time allotted for that. When we think about emotional abuse, emotional maltreatment, unfortunately, a lot of times it may not, it often, I don't think, gets the attention it deserves. I'm certainly not discrediting or minimizing physical or sexual abuse, but the reality is, as bruises can fade and fractures can heal, the harm from emotional abuse often sticks with us for a lifetime. Again, not to say there's not hope and that we can't work through those things, but many individuals, particularly when they experience this type of abuse and it's extensive, long-term or chronic in childhood, they will continue to deal with the harm that it creates and causes as an adult, and may even pass those things on to their own children. That's why I often say, that the harm from emotional abuse often lasts at least a lifetime. Sometimes, and unfortunately, I think many times it may continue on to the next generation. When we think about abuse just in general, obviously, we know sometimes it leaves physical bruises, physical harm on the outside, but I really think of abuse as always leaving internal emotional harm. I can't think of a scenario where a child is being abused by a caregiver or a trusted adult. Again, if we're thinking about, obviously we live in a violent and dangerous world, but of the individuals in that world, you should most be able to trust, that being a caregiver or a close family member or trusted adult. If those people are hurting you, again, there's that emotional layer of harm. Sometimes I describe it as the idea of children who live in these environments, who are experiencing extensive emotional abuse. They develop this idea that there is no safe place. Again, if my home is not safe, if my family is not safe, why would I expect anywhere else to be safe? So again, we're going to get into that a lot further as we continue today. This picture has always spoken to me, just thinking about my own internal and emotional distress and conflict in youth. It's a drawing there that you see, and you see the artist listed there. But again, I think for me, it spoke to me when I saw this as a way to kind of describe, particularly, I think, what children experience when they're experiencing emotional distress and conflict. Again, harm, violence, abuse, always hurtful for kids, but when it's coming from a caregiver, when it's a caregiver who's creating that harm, there's just that added layer of where you're trying to rationalize it. You want your caregivers to be good people. You want your caregivers to be there for you, to be consistent. And when they're not, that's an additional layer of struggle for children. It just feels overwhelming. We think of children experiencing what you see pictured there. They're going to need help to untangle all of that. I think it's rare that someone can find their own way to untangle it. Again, they're often going to be reliant on someone else to provide support, to provide comfort, to provide guidance. And we'll get into that as we go on today. I will say at the end of today's presentation, I want to allow time to look a little bit at intervention, the idea of how do we use the things I'm going to be describing today, and kind of take that information and try to put it to use to help the families that you all are working with on a daily basis. So again, I'm going to provide or present what I think is a very accurate, but at times probably difficult to hear discussion around emotional abuse today. But I'm not just going to leave it at that. We're also going to finish at the end with ways to use that information to try to help and support these families, as that is obviously our goal here. Ideally, they never experience abuse, but if they're experiencing it, we want to catch it early, and we want to make sure that we effectively intervene. So that's my hope today, to share this information, and then that hopefully a great deal of it is helpful to you and can help you in the work that you do to support these families that are likely experiencing these types of things. As Jeff noted, I do a lot of different work in the area of family violence. I write often. You can see my son, William, there reading an article I wrote for the Animal Welfare Institute. A little young there to be reading it, and maybe not quite, based on the content I write about, maybe not great for his age. It's probably good that he couldn't read it, but I speak often about the pet piece, so there's often pictures of pets and animals that accompany my articles, and my kids always like that. I will say I lost him on the next page. Again, this was a publication by the Animal Welfare Institute. On the next page was a picture of a monkey. He became completely consumed with that photo of a monkey. He asked me, he couldn't, he said, I want to meet this monkey, Dad. When are we going to set this up? I tried to help him understand that the monkey wasn't a coworker of mine, that just because the monkey was in a magazine where I had published an article, it didn't mean, that I knew the monkey, but, obviously that wasn't enough. We still talk about that a little bit, and I've still failed to make that meeting happen. I'm pretty sure it was a monkey in the Amazon, so there's some work to be done there, but it's still a work in progress. I also speak often on this issue. I think I've presented, by the end of this year with some new states coming in, I will have presented in about 35, or been hosted by about 35 different U.S. states here in the last several years, and then several countries as well. Again, this work is my passion, and speaking about these issues is something I speak often, but I treat each and every presentation as if it were to be my last. Just again, I hope that energy comes through today, the passion I feel for this topic. A little bit about where that passion comes from. Again, I publish often, write often, speak often, but I also pull from my own personal experiences. as a child growing up in a home where partner abuse was perpetrated. I can remember at right around age 15, waking up one morning to my mom screaming out, crying in my room. My father was standing over me and eventually kind of what I would describe as kind of aggressively or violently stepped over her as he left the room that day. I helped my mom up from the floor, and I told her, if you will not let him back in this house, we will figure it out. I had a sister who was about 6 years younger than I, who was gone that morning. Had already left for school, but lived in the home, obviously. And even at that age, before all of the research and study that's followed, I could see the impact of emotional abuse and what it was having on my mom as she, again, laid there that day on the floor as I helped her up. Obviously, this wasn't the first event. I can remember many nights that preceded that day, laying in bed and being able to hear things, obviously through my bedroom wall. I remember feeling often so sorry and sad for my mom. There was one night in particular where things seemed to escalate. I remember getting out of bed, going up and putting my ear against the wall. And that was the first night where I really remember feeling scared for my mom. Things were certainly changing. And so when this particular moment happened, again, it wasn't just the result of just a knee-jerk reaction, but I had been observing and seeing, not only hearing what was happening, but observing its impact on my mom myself. So I'll pull from that as I speak today. I share that just to help you understand why I'm doing this work. I think back to a lot of the stress that I felt in the home and that I continued to feel and I continued to struggle with as I grew up. And a big part of what I want to do now with my adult life is try to help others who are experiencing that, keep others from experiencing it, and just again to try to spend my life trying to help and support victims and survivors of abuse in all its forms. Again, in the scenario I described and what I experienced, I wasn't the direct target of the abuse, but certainly seeing someone that I loved and cared about being so deeply hurt and harmed by it. I can think of many individuals, myself included, who would say, I would have rather have been the target. It's so excruciating and hard to watch someone you love and care about, be treated in that manner and to see the impact that it's having. I wouldn't wish it on anyone. And again, we sometimes say just emotional abuse, but obviously I'm here to tell you emotional abuse has such a profound and significant impact on the people that are impacted by it. Again, many times it can be a lifelong battle to recover from those things. Again, even if you're not the direct target, but are just witnessing someone you love and care about be affected and impacted in that way. I've shared, and I think I'm getting a little bit of feedback. So if everyone can just confirm that your mics are muted, I think we've got somebody that is speaking in there. I share that again just to help show you again where my passion comes from. But again, I talk about doing a lot of work and doing different things in this area. The title I am most proud of and will always be most proud of, however, is dad. And I'm so thankful. I look back on the left there and I think through some difficult days. I can see the pain and remember the pain that was in my eyes in the picture on the left. You see Shelby there. Shelby's really who got me through. Shelby saved my life as I was struggling with all these things and feeling that no one could understand, no one could relate, no one could help me. Shelby was always there. He never spoke a word, but always said everything I needed to hear. It was his unconditional positive regard, his undying and constant support that got me through. Even as I would struggle with suicide as I got older, and other things such as that, it was always Shelby who helped me. I always believed that I would never have kids because I was afraid. I thought that if I was a father, I was going to, probably just hurt my kids just as mine had hurt me. But again, I'll get to some of the mechanics behind why Shelby on the left helped me to get to the picture on the right. I can't imagine life without my kids. You see my son Will there. We went for his 5th birthday. I took him to see Paul McCartney. That was his first concert. It will be hard to top that for his second concert. He and I both listen to the Beatles. I have a large vinyl collection and expose. He likes the Beatles, and my daughter, she's 4 now, likes Casey and the Sunshine Band. So we have an interesting mix of music going back and forth there. But I took him there to his first concert for his birthday. It will be, again, tough to top that for his second concert. He's talked about maybe Paw Patrol Live. Maybe that will meet Paul McCartney for him. I'm not sure it will for me. But again, just such incredible, happy memories that I'm telling you right now I did not believe possible when I was a kid back in that home I described. So again, I share that just hopefully to provide some hope as we're helping and working with these families. Things can be very difficult. Again, I believed, it's one of the lies of abuse. Abuse lies to its victims. telling you that you have no value, you have no worth, there are no good days ahead. And it may start as a whisper, but it grows louder and louder, and it can become all you hear, to where you actually adopt that and believe it. There are no good days, there are no smiles, there is no happiness ahead for me. And it's not true. And again, many times victims will need our help to get them to that place. As certainly I benefit from the help and support of others, particularly as I got older. But again, I share that because I think it's an important reminder that again, where I'm going to paint an accurate picture, I feel like, of kids in these environments. But it doesn't mean that they can't come through it, that they can't be okay on the other side of it. But it does often take a lot of work to get there. As we talk about emotional abuse today, emotional maltreatment, particularly in the context of domestically violent homes, I'm going to note, or right now, I'm going to note some common misconceptions that I tend to come across as I'm speaking around the country. And hopefully by the discourse today and the things I share will help dispel some of these misconceptions. Hopefully you can already hear it, and something will trigger in your mind and say, that doesn't sound right. But again, these are things that I do hear come up still from time to time as I'm traveling and working with different disciplines. One, untruth: the child has no physical signs of injury and therefore was not victimized by the violence. Falsity number two, a misconception: the child did not see the act and they were not significantly harmed. This is just a thing that I often take issue with. The reality is just because a child doesn't see an act of violence occur doesn't mean they didn't hear it, and doesn't mean they didn't feel it. Even finding an adult or a sibling or a pet who has been significantly harmed by a physical act after it has occurred, obviously still very emotionally impactful and traumatic. Again, just because they didn't see it with their eyes doesn't mean they didn't feel it, doesn't mean it didn't hurt them, and doesn't mean they didn't experience it along with the victim in some way. The child was present for the domestic violence event, but is too young to be adversely affected. Obviously, I'll get into this a little more as we go on, but obviously we know that no child is too young to be affected, not even before birth. We see the fetus as it develops being extremely impacted when mother is victimized, when mother by domestic violence, when mother experiences stress, fear, anxiety, all these types of things that can accompany, or that are part of often of emotional maltreatment, severely and significantly can impact, again, the child before it's even born. So again, this idea that a child was too young to be affected simply is not true, and we'll get more into that as we go on. I really like this quote. It's from a study, not one of mine, but someone else's on emotional maltreatment. They kind of defined emotional maltreatment, or at least identified it as its significance as such. Emotional maltreatment comprises the most damaging and consequential components of child abuse and neglect, and it is the most substantive threat to a victim's mental health. And mental health is important. Again, for some reason, we sometimes see emotional abuse discounted, discredited. But again, I believe emotional abuse to be a direct attack on the human brain. And again, that's a fairly important organ. And we know that many other key body systems are significantly impacted by emotional abuse. And so again, when we look at how it hurts us and how it harms us, it really doesn't make sense that it often takes a back seat to other forms of abuse. Again, not diminishing the other forms. I'm just saying I don't think we pay enough attention or put enough importance in this area, and we certainly should be doing so. Again, its impact is often significant and long-term. When we think about the cycle of abuse, again, I think of emotional abuse as being a key component of that. Again, I can't think of many acts of, or really any acts of physical or sexual abuse that don't also have an emotionally harming impact as well. When we think of an act of physical abuse, as you see here, we often think of the physical harm that's going to come, obviously, from the result of an injury such as the one you see depicted. But we sometimes forget about the fear, right? And the emotional harm and the emotional hurt of the moment too. And when I think about cycles of abuse, again, we know that kids can just replicate the behaviors that they experience or they see their caregivers doing. So again, if a child is physically abused, they may go on to physically abuse their children, but not always. Many kids grow up in homes and they are the direct target of physical abuse, and they do not go on to become a physical abuser. However, that emotional harm from the moment you're seeing depicted such as this can lead to all kinds of other difficulties. It can lead to children, maybe, we think of a child in this scenario in particular, obviously they don't want this to happen. And so whatever caused this event to occur, which looks in this case to be just simply spilling a glass on the floor there. They're going to be super careful to make sure that never happens again. Children may go to great lengths to try to keep these types of events from occurring. This can result in a child, almost, obviously they're likely to potentially to have their emotional needs unmet in this environment, but they can begin to accept that even more so that they don't expect parents to care for them in the way they should. When children kind of grow up in that manner, they grow up to become adults who don't expect their needs to be met. And these children, unfortunately, can become easy targets for a perpetrator of domestic violence. Again, we think of another way cycles can be continued. One way being a child witnesses physical abuse, is abused physically, grows up to be a physical abuser. Another way that a cycle still continues is if a child is victimized in a home such as this, and goes on to be further victimized as an adult, but has children too that are also, again, experiencing that type of abuse. So again, I think there's various ways that cycles of abuse can continue. And when we're thinking prevention, we're trying to think of it from every possible angle. And I know this emotional piece is a big one, and certainly the cornerstone. Jeff noted in the intro, my first book, I actually just finished writing my second book, and it is on breaking cycles of abuse, healing from abuse, and it has a huge emphasis on many of the things we're describing today. I just literally finished writing the first draft, so and the publisher has it now, so hopefully when I have more information, I'll be able to share when a potential and hopeful release date on that will be. When we look at how often different forms of abuse are substantiated, this is in the U.S. from the report you see in the bottom left there, child maltreatment publication there in the U.S. We're looking at, again, focusing on psychological emotional abuse today, and we see it in yellow. Again, when we look at these types of charts, we often see emotional abuse kind of lower than many other forms of abuse. But I don't think it's an accurate indicator of prevalence. Again, I would think about pretty much in every case where neglect, sexual abuse, physical abuse is occurring, there's also this component of emotional harm that is occurring as well. I know that when I'm working with DCS and other agencies around the country, they often note that the difficulty sometimes of approving emotional abuse, and that can result in it being underreported, again, undervalued. But again, I think it's important to note that even though we see that line there, looking shorter than other forms of abuse, I would think it occurs in every case of other forms of abuse and then on its own as well. So really potential to be obviously the most prevalent probably form of child abuse that occurs likely, not just in our country, but in other countries as well, as I do this work and see similar types of statistics there too. One of the things that is different about emotional abuse from other forms of abuse is the proximity required to perpetrate this form of abuse. So I proposed a theory in one of my papers that was published during the pandemic that looked at the idea of the opportunity to abuse theory. And in this theory, I proposed, again, various things, but the thing I'm going to focus on today is when we're thinking physical abuse, sexual abuse, this requires a perpetrator to share the same space in time with the victim. So again, if you want physical abuse not to occur, all that has to happen is that this does not happen. So the perpetrator can't be in the same space and at the same time and in the absence of someone who can keep the abuse from occurring. Otherwise, if we see this type of thing unfold, then we know it's likely to occur. Difficulty with emotional abuse is that it can be perpetrated from any space and at any time. The perp doesn't need to share that space. So while they have to be physically present with the victim to perform an act of physical or sexual abuse, emotional abuse can be perpetrated over great distance. We can think of even landline phones being used. We can think of cell phones, texting, things such as that. Security systems often can be used as a form of emotional abuse and control. Even just regular letters can be used as a form of abuse and control as well. Again, a great difficulty when we think about these things is that emotional abuse can be perpetrated over any distance. Perpetrators are very opportunistic in terms of abuse, and they're, in my mind, constantly evolving. That's why I often say, if we're not learning, we're falling behind when we're thinking about the other side of the field, and when we're trying to stop and reduce and eliminate abuse. Perpetrators, as new technology comes out and advances, we think of the benefits to it. Unfortunately, perps don't play by the rules, and they often and almost always will use that technology to their benefit as well and find new ways to abuse through it. Again, a difficulty in stopping this abuse is that even if the perp is not in the same space, they can obviously still continue to commit these acts and forms of harm. A lot of the info I'll share that I have shared and that I will continue to share comes from the two publications you see there. Both of these I will make available as PDFs at the conclusion of my talk today. On the left, it's a book chapter I wrote for the Pediatric Clinics of North America, their handbook. I wrote the book chapter there on emotional maltreatment. And on the right, a study that I published with a colleague there in the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect, where I talked a little more about some of the things that I'll describe today. So I know we have a good chunk of time today, but there will still be much more that I know when this is over, I'll wish I had said. So here, this gives me a little opportunity to provide that additional information if you'd like to read further and get a little deeper into some of the things I'm describing today. When we think of emotional maltreatment, and again, this comes from the papers that I just shared there. Another difficulty or thing about it is that it can be perpetrated just as a single major incident or as the underlying theme in a series of events. So again, as we're starting to shift here a little bit into the idea more of emotional maltreatment in the context of domestic violence or a child living in a home where partner abuse occurs, we see again that the risk for that in both or both of these things in that environment. So certainly when children live in a home where domestic violence occurs, there will be major incidents. We can think of an instance such as maybe father pushing mother downstairs. Children obviously will be significantly emotionally impacted by that. But then there's also the harm that occurs when emotional maltreatment is perpetrated as essentially a theme underlying a series of events. We think more of manipulation, emotional control, and those types of components as well. And another key difference and thing to note is when we're talking emotional maltreatment, we're not as concerned in terms of whether it's occurring by caregiver intent. Even well-intentioned caregivers can emotionally maltreat children. Now, when we're thinking about intervention, when we're thinking about putting plans and such in place, understanding intent is important because we know obviously if the caregiver is intentionally harming the child, probably a little different than if they're unintentionally. And in person again, I'd get asked, what does it mean to be unintentionally abusive? Parents could be exhibiting patterns of behavior that they learned as children and thought were acceptable or still think are acceptable. They can be doing things such as that, or maybe even manifestations of their own issues or things that they're dealing with. That again, maybe their intent is not to harm their children, but again, it doesn't make it any less impactful on the children, and it certainly doesn't diminish what is occurring. Again, it just helps us when we're thinking about intervention. If we can say, well, the parent probably isn't doing it on purpose, and that it leaves the door open to maybe education can help change that behavior. Whereas if it is an intentional act, again, we're thinking a little differently probably there in our intervention planning. Again, there's no excuse for abuse, and nothing justifies it or makes it okay. It doesn't diminish the act, regardless of what the intent of the caregiver is. But again, when we're thinking about long-term planning, we can think of those pieces sometimes as we're thinking about those things. For many of the reasons I've already described, emotional maltreatment is commonly missed, or at least less often reported than other forms of abuse. We know, again, just from what's in the literature, that at least 75 to 90% of known cases of physical abuse or neglect have an emotional maltreatment component. Again, for me, it's hard to think of it not being 100%. If you're being intentionally hurt or harmed by a caregiver, you're going to be being, and that's in a physical or neglectful manner, certainly you're being emotionally harmed by that as well. One study in particular looked at intake from child services reports. This wasn't in our state of Indiana, it was in a different state. And they noted that while only 9% of the time the child services worker indicated emotional maltreatment on intake, on follow-ups that as much as half of the kids actually experienced it. So again, when we look at prevalence, when we look at these types of estimate numbers, anytime you see a number on emotional maltreatment, it's probably an undercount. There are many reasons why victims aren't able to maybe disclose abuse. Safety is a huge one. There's many other things, but there are so many. It seems like even additional barriers to disclosing this type of abuse. There's also the difficulty of when a child or adult does disclose this abuse. How is it going to be received on the other end? There seems to be a disconnect again, and in many different agencies of not understanding the impact of these types of issues. They can be discredited or again kind of put down, but again the impact is significant. We certainly shouldn't be diminishing that, and certainly if someone's reporting it or if we suspect it, it should be included in that intake. It's important to identify this type of abuse when it is occurring. When we look at different forms of emotional maltreatment, again, from the papers I shared, and these are just the different forms it can take. Again, think about that child in a home where partner abuse, where domestic violence is occurring, and you think about, which of these on this list are they going to be at risk for experiencing? And the answer is each and every form. We think of terrorizing, the idea of being in chaos. Really, an abusive environment is one of chaos, and the children who are in these environments are experiencing that, even if they're not the target. The fear, the stress, the pain, the anxiety, that may be being felt by the caregiver that they're attached to, again, is going to make its way to them too. You can't hurt or harm a caregiver and not hurt or harm any children attached to that caregiver. The well-being of the pair is intertwined. And so I think of one example where a perp actually said, I never targeted the children, just the child's mother. And again, certainly not okay. And I get that that's a rarity. Unfortunately, we know that many perps of abuse will never own or take credit for, or accept the allegations of abuse. They usually will, they tend to more often say that it never happened. So I know it's a rarity there, even for the perp to admit that he was abusive. But again, just the thought of saying, well, I never targeted the kids, just their mom. And again, perps may pick who they target, but they don't get to pick who's harmed by their acts. The reality is you might have just targeted their mom, but you certainly harmed your children as well, because the children and their well-being is so intertwined, again, with their caregivers, with their siblings, and with pets in these homes, that if you target anything attached to them, you're going to impact and hurt and harm your children as well. Spurning, another form of emotional maltreatment, exploiting and corrupting. Again, all of these things are described in greater detail in those papers that I'm going to share. So I won't get too much more into that, other than to kind of list. Again, I think it's helpful to see the different forms it can take. And again, this idea that when we think about children in a home where partner abuse is occurring, they're probably experiencing emotional maltreatment as single incidents, as an underlying theme, and in every single form that it's possible to occur. So again, risk being off the chart for children in homes where partner abuse is occurring for emotional maltreatment. It gets me really to the stage where I certainly believe 100% of children who reside in a home where partner abuse is occurring are being emotionally harmed by it. I just can't. There's just so many different ways that they're likely to be harmed by it. It's just I can't get to a place where I can think of a child living in a home, caregiver being harmed, and they're not being harmed right with that caregiver. Again, even if they're not the target, they're still experiencing that harm. Maybe in a different way, but still, it's likely to be significantly impactful. As I said, we're going to shift a little more now into talking specifically about partner abuse, about domestic violence, and the emotional maltreatment that occurs as part of that. Some of the info I'll be providing comes from another study. This was one of my first major studies that was published in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. I analyzed 9,355 police reports of domestic violence in Marion County, Indiana, explored by various characteristics and details. And I'm just going to quickly provide a couple bits of information from this. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot of info at you in a short period of time, and that's why I'll make sure to include my studies and my slides as well. I certainly thank you and appreciate your time and attention as we get into as much as we can on this topic today. So again, looking at this study and some of the key findings and as it relates to today's topic, one of the things that jumped out is when I looked at U.S. national average reports of domestic violence. And it's important to note that data is collected differently. So usually U.S. national average estimates of partner abuse or intimate partner violence, they are determined by survey results, anonymous retrospective victim surveys. I looked at a different data source, and that being law enforcement reports. So when I looked at police reports for domestic violence in Marion County, Indiana, and I took out any homes where there were multiple events, so I made sure I only single counted households. I still noted that it was occurring at a rate that was nearly double the national average. When you think about my reports or my data source being police reports, we know that only 1 in 4 victims of abuse partner abuse ever contact law enforcement. So again, whatever number we get, if we're trying to estimate prevalence, we multiply by 4. So when you think of it from that aspect, you think of it as potentially occurring at 8 times the national rate in Marion County, Indiana. The other thing that was super alarming was, this large number of cases, and nearly half of them reach the level of severe by research standards. I sometimes get away from using severe because the reality is the next incident of domestic violence or partner abuse could always be a fatal one. And sometimes when we say severe versus less severe, again, regardless of the form of abuse that's occurring, it's certainly harming and hurting those in the home. Severe from an academic classification indicates intentional burn, strangulation, weapon use. So again, that's what's generally classified as severe. So super alarming. Not only are we seeing high prevalence, but we're also seeing many of these cases reaching that level of being classified as severe partner abuse. When we think about other aspects that are going to make sense probably here in a couple minutes, is that I'm going to try to tie in here quickly. Of using police report data. One of the benefits and another reason why I use police report data when I'm looking at my studies is we actually have a time and a date stamp, so we can start to look at trends and patterns and when abuse is occurring. Again, when we're thinking about prevention, gaining any angle or extra bit of information can be helpful. If I was in person, I'd put you on the spot and I'd ask you to pick this. So just think this in your head though. On what day of the week do you think partner abuse is most commonly reported to law enforcement? Give you just a quick second, and then I'll share. For my study, I noted it on Sunday in Indianapolis. So more partner abuse reported on Sunday to law enforcement than any other day of the week. And again, one of the things I often get asked as well is this Saturday night spilling over into Sunday morning. No, this is normally Sunday afternoon, Sunday evening. And I've repeated this in many other states, and again, often observe that same pattern of an increased level of incidence on Sunday. Again, important when we're thinking about prevention and intervention. We're concerned about abuse that occurs on any day, but again, knowing and thinking about Sundays, I think can help guide some of the local interventions we do. Interestingly, when I look at Sunday and we look at what perps and victims say about the day and why they think this reporting level is higher. Perps describe it being the last day of the week, but they're going back to a job on Monday that they hate, that they're stressed. We know alcohol is often involved, so we know those types of pieces are playing there for them. We also hear families describe, well, it's the only day of the week where we're all in the home. Kids aren't in school. Neither parent is working. It's the only day where we're all sharing the same space. And then we also hear the idea that, well, it's the end of the weekend. Kids don't want to go back to school on Monday, and they're just wild, going crazy, all these types of things. So again, when we think about some of those pieces and we think about intervention, I think it's important to note some of those trends. In addition to day of the week, I've also been able to observe, well, what month of the year is partner abuse most commonly reported. And again, the trend I note is that we see an elevated number of reports per day in the months you see listed there, May through August. And so we put the two things together, right? Domestic violence most commonly reported on Saturday and Sunday, and May through August. And we start to think about, household dynamics and the idea that, again, if children are in that home, we know partner abuse that's being reported to law enforcement is most likely to occur at the very times children are most likely to be in the home. So again, speaks to the importance of ensuring that we're including law enforcement in these types of trainings and helping to educate and make sure they understand the impact that these issues are likely to be having on the kids who are in the homes that they're often responding to. When it comes to how often are kids present in these homes, so we talked about the idea that these events often occur at times when if there are children in the home, they're likely to be home. How often are there actually children in these homes? Well, the answer, at least from my study, looking in Marion County, overall, collectively, is 59% of the time. Now you can see it kind of broken down here by the sex of the perp versus victim. And regardless of that breakdown, you see children often present in these homes, all the way, even when it's a male perp and a male victim in a partner abuse type of situation, even a third of those types of incidents will include children in the home, going up to 60% of the time when it's a male perpetrator and female victim. So again, kids often present in these homes when law enforcement is responding. For sake of time, I'm going to skip a couple of these pieces here because I think I've made some of these points already, and I want to get to more of my content. I will share this though because I think it's important to know when we're thinking about, well, why is it important to know if children are in the home? And again, hopefully most people that are on this call or in this webinar would already know the answer to that. But when we think about maybe working with others who may not or who may not understand the impact that domestic violence can have on children, this is a stat and a finding from a study that I go to often because it seems to get their attention. We know that just in general, from the U.S. Department of Health, 1% of the entire U.S. child population is indicated to be a victim of when they're usually counting abuse statistics, they're looking at physical or sexual abuse or neglect, 1% in general. This number goes up to 60% when we know that domestic violence is occurring in the home. So what we're seeing here, and what this one study in particular noted, is that children who reside in a home where partner abuse is occurring are at 60 times the risk of suffering abuse or neglect. And again, most of the time when we're thinking studies such as this, they're looking at physical sexual abuse. Again, when I'm talking emotional abuse, I can't imagine a scenario where a child is not experiencing emotional abuse. I think it's 100% for that. But even the other forms of abuse, obviously very prevalent in homes where partner abuse is occurring. Again, I'm going to skip, for sake of time, I wanted to skip a couple of these things. I do want to share this. This is a quote from a adult victim in a home where partner abuse was occurring. We never knew which person we would get, the nice one or the really, really bad one. And again, we think back to what I described an abusive environment as one of chaos and inconsistency, which is exactly the opposite of what children need mentally and emotionally. They need to feel safe, they need to feel loved, they need to feel supported, they need that consistency. It's very important to kids. And in these types of environments, where particularly when there is an emotionally abusive partner, and again, maybe they're not even targeting the kids are still going to experience it and pick up on it. I talked about the example earlier where we saw the photo where it looked like maybe the child had knocked their glass over, and the abusive response to that. Again, these kids are going to live in a way that some describe essentially as kind of walking on eggshells. Well, I may not be the direct target in this moment, but it's a short walk for the perp to turn from that person to me. And again, living in that daily fear that obviously I'm hurt and I hate seeing my caregiver or my sibling being harmed. But the reality is it could be me very quickly. And living in that type of environment, again, is emotionally draining, exhausting, and extremely harmful for these kids. Again, it's this idea of just a deadly undertow. We think of acts of physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect. Again, what these acts tell the victim time and time again, over and over again, is they have no value, they have no worth. The emotional harming undertow of these aspects is, again, what can long-term affect these individuals. Again, even if they're never the direct target of the abuse, just growing up in a home where it's occurring certainly often stays with them and can kind of set their life course in motion. Again, I think of the impact of abuse. Certainly life-changing, life-altering, can be life-shortening and life-ending as well. Often a profound impact when it's occurring in your youth and childhood. When we think about measuring and considering that emotional impact a little further, I kind of noted earlier, but I'll kind of revisit this thought just for a second. Even if you're a child who's not, even if you're not witnessing directly the act of abuse or harm to a caregiver, even just finding that caregiver after the abuse can be harmful as well. Here's one study shared a story of a child and some examples they provided. One night, the perpetrator hurt my mom, and then he left. Mom came crying up to my room. So again, in the way that the article or the study described this event, the child didn't directly witness it, didn't see it with his eyes, but again, probably heard it, knew it was happening, and then obviously witnessing the impact emotionally on his mom as his mom came up to his room afterward. I was always worried about my mom. I thought she was going to get hurt. And again, that's living with that fear, not being the direct target, but still certainly being impacted by it. I felt unsafe, scared all of the time. I didn't sleep. I used to sleep at school. Quite distressing, actually, because I knew that if we stayed in that environment, we would all die. Again, the words of a kid and the weight that they're carrying. I'll talk just briefly on that school piece because I think it's an important part. The reality is, and certainly not the way we want it to be, but unfortunately, as you know, in this field, we sometimes have to, we have to trade ideal for realistic. And ideally, this would not be the case, but realistically, it is. That many kids are only safe when they're at school. It might be the only time that they feel they can let their guard down. And so one of the things we can see them doing in that scenario is falling asleep in the classroom. Now, not every time a child falls asleep in the classroom, it's not always an indicator of abuse or harm in the home, but it certainly should be in our differential when it continues to happen. Again, thinking that it's the one time that stress response lightens up, that one chance that their body feels safe, that they can take a breath. Again, when they're home, they're afraid. They're living in fear, even if it's not just for themselves, but for others. When they get to school, it might be that chance to relax. And I can think of several examples of astute school counselors noting that a child was falling asleep continuing in the classroom, asking them and the why, which is a question that's so important to ask that we don't always ask. But when we're seeing these behaviors, asking children, or at least trying to examine, because they may not know how to tell us, but at least trying to understand what they mean and asking why is it happening, so important. Children, certainly may not always be able to tell us or describe what they're experiencing, but they usually show us through their behaviors in one way or another, whether it's acting out physically or in an external fashion, or more internalizing these types of events, falling asleep, such as in these types of scenarios. Again, we have to be paying attention. Children are telling us things all the time, and a lot of that communication may not be the spoken word, but more through their actions. And understanding what those signs can look like is important, and another reason why we have to be including schools in our process to work and assist these families and these children in particular, understanding what some of these behaviors can indicate. One of the things I think we get wrong when we estimate emotional impact for children in homes where partner abuse is occurring, we think of it kind of as a series of peaks and valleys. So let's say, like the example I used earlier, if father pushes mother down the stairs, that's going to be a peak. That's going to be obviously a major moment where the child is going to experience emotional harm. But let's say nothing major in terms of the partner abuse and physical violence occurs for 2 weeks. And then I think we get it wrong, where we assume, well, that's like a 2-week reprieve. Not for kids. It's not up and down for them. It is a constant stay in the peaks, because the entire amount of time in between the major events, they are just fearing that next event. They are living their life braced for impact, which means, again, it's a constant stay in the peaks. The stress system is constantly firing, which means their body is constantly bracing and preparing for that next event. There is no break. There's no reprieve. And again, that's why I describe, some of these kids live at that heightened level the entire time they're at home. So when they go to the library, when they go to school, it might be the one chance that their body gets to take a break and rest there. And we can see them falling asleep or acting out in other ways, again, because of what is occurring in the home environment. I'll share 2 examples, and then for sake of time, again, unfortunately, I think my full presentation on this topic is closer to about 6 to 8 hours. So I knew we weren't going to run out of content today, but I thought kind of as we get into it, I would kind of, as I said, I'll share all of my slides, but I may skip a couple slides here more as I want to get into the next bit to make sure I have time for questions at the end. I will share 2 police reports of domestic violence, though. I think it's helpful to, again, when we think about some of the misconceptions I shared earlier, to look at actual cases and reports. And again, I share this. These are law enforcement reports. These 2 are that I'm going to share. But these are sentiments that I hear from other disciplines as well. So this is certainly not singling out law enforcement. A lot of my research and work comes from law enforcement data, so that's why I have it available, but it's certainly not something I just hear from officers. The suspect reportedly chased the victim throughout the home before the victim managed to lock herself in the upstairs bathroom. The suspect broke through the bathroom door with a baseball bat and dragged the victim down the hall to her bedroom. Victim struggled with the suspect, at which point he struck the victim over the head with a lamp, knocking her unconscious. The victim's 3 children were present in the home, but they'd been locked in their rooms and had prior to the incident and did not witness the event. So again, a lot of things, a lot of red flags. If we were in person, I would ask you if you were concerned by this, and if anyone said they were not concerned, we would have to start this presentation all over. Obviously, I would hope that there are already things that would have concerned you before this presentation, but certainly by this point, I would hope there are other things too. When I hear that the children were locked in their room, obviously that implies locked from the outside. So I'm starting to wonder what's going on there with the lock outside the bedroom door. Is this a routine? If you're a child in that room and you hear that door being locked, you probably know what's coming, right? It's a caregiver trying to protect me, but you're probably still going to hear it. Think about the violence that we're describing here. Certainly they couldn't see it, but they absolutely could hear it. They could feel it. Again, I think that's often the case. Children don't just witness domestic violence, they experience it too. And these kids and the fear that they would experience while in this type of environment obviously cause for great concern. We should, a lot of agencies will, when they're responding to domestic violence, they will look for physical injury. So does the child have a black eye? Do they have a fracture, something such as that? And they will use that as their determining factor about whether to involve or include child services. But again, I think we miss a lot of kids that are being significantly impacted when we take that kind of stance. These children may not have had physical injury, but they were certainly significantly impacted by an event such as this. I'll share one last example before I move on. The suspect allegedly struck the victim with an open hand, knocking her to the ground. Their 1-year-old child was present, but was not physically injured or involved. The child was crying on scene, but was able to be comforted. No referral was made to child services, as the child was not physically injured and is too young to be affected. Again, should be all kinds of internal alarms going off when you're reading that. Worried about many things here. And we already talked about the idea that even before birth, children are impacted by these types of events. We think of the impact of toxic stress, and the idea of parental pathway is how it's often described. How when mom is experiencing stress, it's impacting the development of the fetus and harming that baby before it's even born. And we certainly would be afraid of risk here for this 1-year-old as well. I can think of one example where a responder said, I used to always think that before the age of 2, children weren't impacted by these events. Again, it's hard sometimes when we hear things like that. And again, we're a little, if you're in this field, if you're in this work, then obviously you're probably exposed more to the research and understanding of why that's not accurate. But I've heard that a few different times, that age range. And I think where that comes from is the research indicates that in terms of an adult looking back at their childhood, the first real concrete memories start at around age 3 or 3.5. So I think sometimes people misread that to believe, well, if a child can't remember a concrete event before the age of 3, that means if they're experiencing events such as the one I'm describing here, they're never going to remember this. But something I usually say when I'm confronted with that type of thinking is the reality is, sure, this 1-year-old probably, when they're 18 or 20 or 22, they're probably not going to be able to describe this event to you. But the reality is I think of myself, if I'm having a bad dream, if I have a nightmare, sometimes I'll wake up and my body is in fight or flight. I might even be sweating. I may not remember what I just dreamed, but I know I'm scared. I know it scared me, and I know I'm afraid of it. And I think that's what often happens for these kids. Sure, they may not be able to describe it, especially a 1-year-old. They may not, again, if they're not even, if they can't vocalize what's going on, then obviously they can't tell you or talk about it. But they know they're afraid. And again, these types of injuries and this harm stays with you. It is an imprint. It imprints your brain. It imprints your body. It changes the way your body responds to stress. So yes, even before a child can talk to you, even before they can walk, even before they're born, they're already learning how to respond to stress, and they're already being significantly hurt and harmed by events such as this. Again, I know I've said it many times, but I don't think it can be overstated. The need that we understand that better and that we respond more appropriately. Just the significant impact of not even being physically harmed, but the emotional impact of seeing another be harmed and hurt is significant on children. I kind of just already shared this, so I'll go ahead and skip that. I wanted to move, as I said, into kind of this next section. We're right at about, it looks like about the halfway point of the webinar. I'll probably speak for about 45 more minutes and then allow the last 15 for questions, just to give you an idea of the flow and where we're going today. Again, it might be here during your lunchtime, and so I know I'm throwing a lot of information at you at a short period of time, but I appreciate your time and attention today. So let's talk about a little bit about how these things we've described, how do they impact children? What is the impact of emotional maltreatment? Often extensive, unfortunately. When we think about children from their earliest stages of infancy, obviously they're often and are always quite dependent on their caregivers to provide an environment that's conducive to health and growth. We know when we're born, in particular, our brain is not at full size. Again, so much of our development is based on those early days, those early months, and those early years, and that we have an environment that's safe and healthy for growth. Again, when we think of kids in these environments, they are very unlikely to see that. Abuse, again, is chaos. It's chaotic. It's the opposite of what we need in terms of thinking of a healthy, safe place to grow. And again, we see a lot of these types of injuries, again, being in some cases can even be permanent to a certain extent. Certainly there's research, there's science looking at even finding ways to enhance some of the structural damage caused by early trauma, and we know that those things are there. But again, ideally, as I said, we protect early childhood, and we don't have to deal with these issues when they're adults. So again, if we can do a better job of prioritizing and protecting childhood, we don't have to deal with these issues, and they don't have to deal with these issues as they become adults. Just another thinking of one of the other presentations I give, which is the connection from family violence to community violence. Too often, we can hear individuals kind of write off family violence, saying, well, that's family business that occurs in their home. It's their issue. Let them deal with it. Obviously, a terrible stance to take. But the reality is no one has that luxury of saying and containing, saying where abuse stays or where it's contained. I often say, if you want to know how bad community violence will be, 5 years from now, look at how bad abuse is in the homes in your community right now. Abuse, violence, harm always finds its way outside of the home. And again, if we did better at protecting childhoods, I think we would see obviously prevalence of community violence come down as well. Toxic stress is a big component of this that can cause just such significant harm to these kids. Again, not all stress is harmful, but when you're living in an environment where you're afraid possibly for your life and for at least the well-being of those around you, you are constantly in a state of stress. Cortisol is one of the hormones our body releases to restore us to homeostasis. So when we respond to stress, our heart goes up, our blood pressure goes up. Cortisol is one of the things our body disperses to bring us back down. It's supposed to be just in kind of steady, contained doses. Again, not all stress is bad stress. For these kids, though, it is firing all the time. We see this hormone in others constantly running through their bloodstream, and this can cause great harm to our body's key systems. One of the things it can do, too, is obviously completely rewire and change the way their body and brain reacts to stress. So later on in life, and even then in the moment as a child, they will experience more of a hyper responsive system to stress or under responsive. So when I think of hyper again, we think of an event that might cause just a small amount of stress for anyone else, causing a huge amount of stress for someone who's living in this state of constant stress. We can also see it going the other way, and I think of children kind of with that flat affect, when they should be experiencing stress or you would expect them to be showing emotion, and instead they're not. Again, just because they look calm and okay on the outside doesn't mean they're okay on the inside, and I'll get a little more into that here in a couple slides. When we think about the impact of experiencing toxic stress, we talked already about this idea that children are too young to be affected and why it's not true. This is a big part of why the research indicates that. We know that, again, that children at any age and adults as well are significantly impacted by experiencing toxic stress. We can think of PTSD symptomology as well and the impact on the brain that has. Something I often talk about when we're talking about PTSD is that we think of members of the military experiencing PTSD, but we also know victims of trauma and abuse in the home experience PTSD as well. The reality is our brain doesn't care if that fear of death, fear of harm, and stress is occurring overseas or if it's occurring in the living room. When you're living in that state of fear, again, the impact is significant. And again, research indicates that the younger the child, the more severe the deficits. So again, this idea that children are too young to be affected is so backwards, because we're worried about any child of any age, but particularly in those early days and those early months and even pre-birth, the impact is so severe. And again, it speaks to the importance of children who, and many children at any age really struggle to have a voice for themselves. It's hard for them to find adults they can trust when they're talking about abuse and things that are hitting so close to home. But particularly these children who don't even have a voice yet, who in terms of literally and can't speak and are at these early ages and stages, again, so critical that others are defending them and ensuring that they're if they're living in these environments, that we understand the risks there, and the great harm that is unfortunately likely occurring. When we think a little further of the impact of toxic stress, we know it can have a significant impact on brain volume. You see the other things listed there. Again, emotional maltreatment can affect a child in so many ways. Again, it doesn't mean they can't overcome this as an adult, but again, if we don't effectively intervene, they will continue to deal with these things as an adult. It often sets forth a pattern of both behavior and health that becomes increasingly harder to turn around the farther we get down the road. Again, doesn't mean it's not possible, but again, when these children are experiencing these types of things and experiencing the symptomology associated with abuse, again, maybe not even if they're the target of the abuse, but witnessing it, it sets forth a chain of events that once we get on the wrong side of, becomes so much harder to stop and turn around. There is one study I think that's particularly interesting that you see noted there, that sometimes when we think about the impact of emotional abuse and stress on children, we think of cognitive deficits. But I like this study kind of referred to it more as cognitive adaptations. So while children may not perform well on school tests when they're living in these environments, they're probably very good at ascertaining risk for themselves. Again, this idea that when kids are living in these environments, it's probably hard for them to prioritize a vocab test or quiz. Not to say that that's not important, but when you're afraid for your life, again, you're probably consumed more with thinking about those types of things. You're thinking more about your safety, your sibling's safety, your parents' safety, your dog's safety. That's going to be most of what you think about and most of where your energy goes. So again, while they may not do well in school, it may not be necessarily that this cognition is in some cases as much of a deficit as it is adapted, and they're just focusing on things that children should never have to focus. Children should get to be children for as long as they are children, and unfortunately these kids in these homes, they don't get to do that. I think sometimes we sugarcoat it and we talk about children growing up too quickly. I really hate it when I hear that, because these children, they don't grow up too quickly. They have their childhoods taken from them. They don't get a say in this. It's not up to them. It's not their choice. They find themselves in these conditions and in this environment where they really have no other choice to take action and to do different types of things to try to protect their family or themselves, whatever that may look like. I think it's so important that we learn and we work better on protecting childhoods, and just another reason why that's important. Sometimes, when we think about the harm associated with emotional maltreatment, we think of the idea of invisible injury. I get what people are saying there. There's no, emotional maltreatment doesn't necessarily create physical bruises on the outside of the body. But the reality is while it may not be bruising the outside of the body, it's certainly bruising the inside. It's certainly causing real harm inside. Again, as I said, I think of emotional abuse as directly targeting the human brain, which again controls all of our body systems. So we think of the impact as being significant. And the reality is too is these visualizations or behavioral characteristics related to the abuse they will be something you can see eventually. Again, children will act out, they'll respond. They will eventually have physical harm from these types of injuries as well. But certainly early on in the process, we often see it going on inside rather than outside. That's why I often say, abuse always creates harm on the inside and sometimes on the outside as well. So again, even if there's physical abuse, we know there's harm on the inside, and sometimes there's no outward signs of injury, but still great injury on the inside. We can visualize this when we look at radiology exams. So you see here a CT case study by Bruce Perry, who does tremendous work. If you're not familiar with his work in looking at neurobiology and neuroanatomy and the impact of emotional abuse and other forms of abuse. In this particular case study, there was no known history of physical or sexual abuse. This was sensory deprivation, that emotional neglect, that environment that is likely the case in many homes where partner abuse is occurring. You see the normal size 3-year-old brain on the left, and then again, the child on the right who's living in that environment. You see the difference in brain size as well as key areas and impacted that include learning capacity and other things such as that. You can also observe it on a PET scan. And when you're looking at PET scan, you're looking for bright colors to indicate blood flow. So on the left, you see a normal brain. Again, on the right there, a child's brain in a home where no known physical or sexual abuse, just again, that emotional neglect, emotionally abusive home environment. Again, you can observe those types of things. So again, unfortunately, we can't do radiology exams for all these kids to try to prove what's going on in the home. Obviously, we know cost, we know exposure to radiation. But one way that I think is interesting that seems to be getting a little more attention is the idea of cortisol swabs and understanding our cortisol flow through our body. I already mentioned cortisol as being one of the hormones our body disperses to restore homeostasis. So again, it makes sense that if a child is experiencing constant stress, their cortisol levels are likely to be elevated. Or again, we can see it either very high or very low. So our normal response, you can see there in the chart, the black dots indicate a normal dispersal of cortisol throughout the flow or throughout the day, a normal flow. And you see the red above, and I think it's like a yellow or a gray below. Again, those describing individuals where the level or the flow is unhealthy, and that's an extreme risk of harm and other types of things that occur. So again, when we think about how do we visualize these types of things, I think this is something that at least has my attention as being interesting. Again, when we think about measuring cortisol levels, it's usually just a saliva swab. So obviously not much less invasive, low cost. Again, there seems to be more and more research in that area. One of the things that I often say too, I have a post-it note in my office that says, make perpetrators uncomfortable in terms of in the work that we're doing, because I think they are growing quite comfortable. And I think emotional abuse, they continue to view as something that they're likely to get away with because of how hard it is to prove. So anytime I start seeing things such as this, that at least show some sort of hope of a physiological indicator that again is maybe lower cost, certainly has my attention. The reality is there are ways to prove emotional abuse too. Again, we're looking at pattern behavior and patterns over time that can indicate harm. And also, again, we know that if we can prove that the perpetrator is targeting someone else in the home, then we know that the child is impacted as well by that. All those things can be helpful when we're trying to show, that this harm is occurring. I'll share this last little bit before I move on to the next piece of the presentation. This comes from, again, one of my studies where I looked at police officer observations on scene. So victim calls 911 most of the time. That's usually where the police call comes from. Police officer arrives on scene. How does the victim of domestic violence appear? Not surprising at all that they most commonly are reported by the police officer to appear afraid, complaining of pain, and crying. So this is the adult victim appearing in this manner. When we think about children, when we think about attachment, they're, for many reasons, they're probably unlikely to form secure attachments to the perpetrator of abuse. They're probably their best chance of a strong attachment is with this individual here, the victimized adult. And so if the adult is appearing in this way, how do you think the children appear on that same scene? And concerning, and it sounds a little backwards, but concerning. And we see, again, this is a large N value in this study. Half of them calm, as described by police officers. And it sounds kind of counterintuitive to be concerned about calm children. I want children to be calm when they should be calm, but I'm worried about children when they're calm when they shouldn't be. And this is one of those times. Again, we just talked about how their best chance at a secure attachment is doing, and that individual is not doing well. And for a child to be able to see that and still at least appear calm on the outside, for me, it's so many red flags. And so it's something I work often with law enforcement. And the idea is, a calm child does not mean an okay child. And just because a child is able to sit there and tell you that they're okay doesn't mean they are. When I see this, I think of that potential broken stress response. We talked about that flat affect where their body is going crazy. But on the outside, they look normal. They look, controlled and calm. I'm concerned about a pattern here. One of the things I noted in this study that we didn't really have time to get into is when we look at police reports for domestic violence, on average, a victim that does report, they've already experienced 10 incidents before they do. So again, this pattern is already well on its way. So, this could be the idea of, well, for a child, they've seen this type of violence so many times already. They also could be in fear and kind of in shock. They could have been coached by the perp and told, if you say anything, if you do anything, you're going to be next, or someone else that they love and care about is going to be harmed. So many reasons why we should be concerned about calm children. And we know law enforcement is even more likely to indicate they're calm when it's a child under the age of 5. So again, another aspect where it's important that we're reminding professionals that are responding to these incidents that calm is not necessarily good when the child shouldn't, or we wouldn't expect them to be calm. So again, something I think that I hope is a takeaway for you and something to remember, this idea that children may appear calm in these scenes or on these scenes and in these environments, but certainly shouldn't be taken necessarily as an indicator of risk or harm or impact of the abuse, other than to say, well, it gives us reason for pause there to think a little harder about that. I've already talked a lot about this, so I'm going to skip these slides. Let's check in on time. I'll speak for about 35 more minutes, and then we'll do questions. The reality is when we think about emotional abuse, I already talked about that it's not determined necessarily by intent, though a well-intentioned perpetrator can emotionally, or well-intended caregivers can still harm emotionally their children. The reality is in these environments, often we see risk of harm from both the perpetrating parent and the victimized parent. And I say that carefully. I've had someone say, well, you're trying to just put even more blame or hurt or harm on the victim. That's certainly not the case in what I'm doing here. When we're thinking about child health, though, this is certainly something that we don't talk enough about, that we need to talk more about. And that is, we think about when the perpetrator leaves the home. Really, in many ways, our work is just beginning. I don't believe that you can heal from abuse until you're safe from abuse. And so when we think about an adult victim who now may be safe, now if there's children involved, perps will often continue to use those children to inflict harm. But at least if there's physical safety, victims themselves are going to be just finally at a state where they can try to heal. And if they have children, it's going to be very hard for them to meet the needs of those children. Again, not because they don't want to be there for them, just because when you're an abuse victim and you've been abused for such a long period of time, you have so much taken from you that there's little left to give. And it becomes an added layer and difficulty for victims when they feel like they're failing their children just because they don't have that extra to give them. Again, another unfairness of abuse. The perp has taken that, and it's another way that emotional harm kind of shows itself, maybe in a more subtle way that we don't as often recognize. Again, a result of the abuse. And even though the perp now is not physically in the same environment, their harm is still causing difficulty for victims and their children in this way. I'll share, this is not from a law enforcement, this is from, I think it was a child services, from a study, but a child services report. The violent offending caregiver has been imprisoned and therefore no longer has access to the children in the home. The mother has no intention of letting him return, so the threat has been removed. Again, this would be one of those things where if in person I asked and everyone felt good with this, we would have to start the presentation over. So I'm fortunate for you all that no one's in that position, but I would hope that that you would see the concern and reason for concern there. Again, we know there's many things going on here. There's no guarantee that this perp won't come back. And if we're not working with the adult victim toward healing and helping them maybe better develop healthy normals for relationships, they're likely to go right into another abusive relationship. We also think of many of the barriers to ending relationships. We know adult victims of domestic violence will try often 7 times before they're successful to end a relationship. And there's so many variables in play there, and that includes finances, it can include religion, so many different things that we have to identify and work to address if we're going to ensure that victims stay not only apart from the perpetrator in this instance, but also from not getting into another abusive relationship and exposing themselves and their children to that risk again as well. Again, I kind of indicated this, but here's kind of the mechanism I'm describing when we think of risk for children from a victimized adult. We see the caregiver's emotional needs are unmet, and so they are just unable to meet the needs of the children. We see a breakdown there of the relationship, more difficulties in behaviorally in the child, it only gets harder, and then there's further exasperation. So again, when we think about these child-adult pairs, it's so important to remember just because the abuser is left doesn't mean we're good now. It's a good step, and it can start the process, because again, you can't heal until you're safe. But again, if that abuser is still connected to those children, as they often are, they're even more likely probably to use that child to try to harm the adult, as maybe their only way to still do so. And there are so many other aspects to this when we think of the emotional health, emotional maltreatment side, that we have to recognize and have on our differential if we want to continue to help these families and ensure they don't go back to a relationship with that same abuser, or a new abuser comes in to take the place of the other one. For sake of time, I'm going to skip this just because I want to finish and allow time for questions here on time. But again, anything I don't cover today, I will share in my slides. One of the things I do want to note, again, I've said this so many times, or I've said it a few times here just in these last little bits here. But again, I just want to say it one last time. When we think about an abusive perpetrator, if the abuse is identified and the perp leaves the home, again, the abuse and harm doesn't necessarily stop, it more often changes. And if there's children involved, they're going to be at the center point, most likely. They may be the only way the perp can still harm the victim. Most of these perps won't let it go. They don't just go off quietly into the night. It's not just, well, they've been caught, they've been exposed, they move on. They do not take that well. They do not respond well when their abuse is identified. When it's called out, they do not respond well at all, and that's putting it lightly. They can become a huge risk. We know for adult victims of domestic violence, their greatest risk really is after they end the relationship. We know there's great risk spikes of homicide and things such as that. But again, when we think about children and their risk, I think it elevates obviously as well too. When perps can sense that an adult victim is about to report their abuse, they will often do anything they can to keep that abuse hidden. And it may mean elevating or changing up their method of abuse in the home. So maybe they weren't targeting children before, but they will begin to now, or they'll begin to target pets, or they'll find other ways, anything they can do to keep that abuse a secret and to keep it hidden. That's their whole goal. How do I keep this abuse hidden and keep it a secret? And as it gets pulled closer and closer into the light and out into detection, they become more desperate. And so again, it's not like, well, once it's out in the light and someone knows about it, that they're just like, oh, I lost that battle. They are not generally okay with it. And again, I think of that risk just changing, and children possibly being at even greater risk when that separation occurs, because again, it may be the only way the perp feels that they can still get back at that adult victim who now no longer resides with them. And they will try other ways too. Obviously, as I said, they're opportunistic. They're going to try out, we think of stalking, we think of all kinds of things that we shouldn't be very concerned by and about. But again, I think risk for children, major factor when we're thinking about those types of pieces as well. I'm going to shift when I talk about risk. Again, I know I'm throwing a lot at you, but like I said, I don't apologize for it. I want to make sure I get as much information as I can to you in the time, whatever time I'm allotted. And so again, I appreciate your time and attention. A follow-up study to one of the earlier ones I shared has an additional piece that I want to add here in this presentation. I'm looking at my time. I'm probably going to speak on this kind of line of thought now for the next maybe 10 minutes or so. And then I'll shift and start talking about intervention and how we use this info to try to help families. And then, as I said, I'll conclude with questions. This study, I don't know, I haven't checked it lately, but it was like the first or second most shared study in the history of or at least that's been tracked in the Journal of Interpersonal Violence. I looked at my initial study that I talked about where I analyzed all those police officer reports in Marion County. And I looked at one factor in particular, and that is, does the perp have a history of harming pets? When I was looking at all the different characteristics that were noted in my initial study, it quickly jumped out to me that when a perp had a history of harming pets, it seemed to spike risk in really every area. For instance, when a partner abuser also harms pets, we know risk of strangulation is dramatically elevated, risk for weapon use, with risk of threatening a partner with a weapon, all kinds of other risk of rape or sexual assault, rape, forced sex, I think was actually called, and the study is the way that the question was asked by the officer. All of these things dramatically increased risk just by knowing one thing, that the perp also has a history of harming pets. We know that pets are often part of these families. As I said, collectively, children are in 59% of homes where partner abuse occurs. In one study in particular, noted that 80% of the homes in the study had at least one pet. So pets probably even more prevalent in homes where partner abuse is occurring. And again, particularly when that perp seems to sense that the victim may be about to end the relationship or report the abuse, I see both children and pets finding themselves in the crosshairs, be more likely to. They become a quick target. They know it's effective. Perps do. If I threaten pets, it's going to probably get what I want out of the victim. And the reality is at least in the work that I see, when a family violence perp threatens pets, they usually carry it out. It's not usually an idle threat. If they say they're going to kill or hurt the pet, they usually do. Victims know that. It can be extremely effective, unfortunately, and keeping victims from reporting. We know children are often attached to animals in the home, so again, it can be that additional layer of emotional harm and control as well. When we look at, as I said, the purpose of the study was to look at different aspects and divide it by IPV suspect versus suspect with a history of animal abuse. Again, when we think about that toxic stress environment, that's why I wanted to bring this in. We know just in general, in my study in Marion County, adult victims of domestic violence or partner abuse, 35% of them live with daily fear they will be killed. This gets to PTSD, as I noted earlier. When we think about severe PTSD symptomology, we associate it with the chronicity of duration one spends fearing for their life. That's why we think about soldiers returning from battle or war and bringing PTSD with them. Again, it's that long-term fear for one's safety and life. And then again, when I talked about that earlier already, the brain doesn't care though, whether that's overseas or in the living room. That's why we see victims of abuse experiencing similar PTSD symptomology as we do soldiers returning from war. We see 35% in general of these victims living with this fear, goes up to nearly 80%. Nearly 80% of victims of partner abuse, when the perp also harms pets, fear daily for their life. Again, children are living that and experiencing it as well. So just again, we're concerned about partner abuse when it's occurring in any home, but we know when there's this added line or wrinkle of pet abuse as well, risk for all seems to skyrocket. I'm just sharing one example there, but again, for sake of time, but in my study, I noted several other characteristics where we see the same leap and jump in risk. All right, as I said, I'll go ahead and get into this now, I guess, just for the next probably 20 to 24 minutes or so. I want to allow as much time for questions as I can, so I'll try to finish right around at that time. Ideally, we prevent these things from happening, but if they are happening, we want to catch them, and we want to catch them early. And then we want to make sure when we've caught them that we do something about it. Another thing that I say often is, turning a blind eye to abuse is the same thing as telling the abuser to carry on. We have to make sure that we are not only within our professional capacity, but also educating the general public about the idea of if they see abuse, to report it, to do something about it. And then we have to take those reports and make them count. I think of a couple studies that in particular looked in the medical field, and I would assume it's probably gotten better. The study was several years ago, but you never know. That was looking at I believe it was medical students, and again, I know this area has been a greater focus more recently, so we would hope it would be higher. But of medical students and the idea and importance of the screening that they do for domestic violence. And the reality was that the question they were asking is, if you were to get a positive screen where the victim disclosed abuse, do you know what to do? And it was like half of them had no idea what to do next. And so again, that's an important part of this process and step, not just medical providers, medical students, but really in all fields that we know that we're asking about these things, but we also know what to do when we see it and the appropriate response. An abuse disclosure can be a victim trusting you with their life. It can be that serious. And so how we handle it and how we deal with it is very important. And making sure we do so in an appropriate and timely fashion is critical. So we're going to talk a little bit about some other programs and things that are out there, and some ideas, and then hopefully as you've sat through this, as you thought through some of the things I've said, and maybe as you go through some of the materials that I'll share at the conclusion, that you can generate some kind of your own ideas of ways that you can think about better incorporating some of these things into your work, in whatever capacity you work with families in this area. Certainly, the idea or the need to improve our efforts is needed. We know that the pandemic had a significant impact mentally on all. I've published a couple different papers, and I talked about the theory that I proposed, the idea that abuse likely increased. Now, in a lot of states and across the country, we saw child abuse reports go down during lockdowns. But that made no sense at a time when, it didn't make sense if we were assuming that it was an accurate indicator of prevalence, because I believed abuse was actually likely to be increasing. Again, perps are very opportunistic, and when accountability goes down, I believe abuse goes up. And so when there's less opportunity to detect, perps feel maybe they have the green light more so to abuse. And so we know schools are the #1 report source for abuse. And so when schools closed and we switched to online learning, there was fewer opportunities to detect abuse. In my mind, it sounds nothing like these abusers to say, well, you know what, it's the pandemic, so let's just give everybody, I'm not going to abuse anyone. It doesn't make any sense. When we think about the natural disaster literature, we know when there's a great stressor, such as a disaster, that abuse always goes up, particularly partner abuse when it's measured. It's always increased. It's almost impossible that I've found any kind of reporting or study that noted that when a natural disaster occurs, abuse goes down. It always generally goes up, and it's usually significant increase. So again, I think there's no it doesn't make sense to think that, abuse went down during lockdowns when kids were separated from key report sources. Rather, I think it went the other way. We're continuing to see papers and studies share the alarming state of children's mental health across our country. Could be from stress, could be from other things, but I think a lot of it could be tied back to witnessing or experiencing abuse in the home as well. When we think about kind of expanding our nets and casting wider nets, I think, again, as we know, the pandemic changed a lot of things, particularly when we had those periods of lockdown, when we found these families more likely to be isolated. Certainly, we need to be expanding our partnerships. And that means looking at your community and thinking, who am I not working with that I should be? Again, when I was thinking about lockdowns and things such as that, I was thinking about, some of the essential workers that were still out or categorized as essential workers, such as postal workers, garbage collectors, home repair, all these things were still happening. So hopefully we never have another pandemic lockdown type of scenario, but if we were to, we at least know that these are probably people we need to be talking to before that happens, because once this happened and schools lost contact, churches lost contact, all these other organizations closed, these individuals were still out in the community. So even helping them understand, hey, like, if you see something, now is at a time when we have even less opportunity to detect. If you see something, here's how to report it. Again, we're not asking them to run into the home and intervene in an inappropriate manner, but rather to report it to the proper agency so they can do something about it. So again, think about that in your own organization, in your own community. How can I expand? Who's not at the table that should be? What are these organizations that we always want to make sure too, I should say, that our ask is fair. So again, we're not telling them and expecting them to do something, again, like running the home, but again, a reasonable ask. So for a postal worker, maybe it's just creating an index card that you could say, hey, just a reminder that they could put somewhere on their vehicle. If you see abuse, here's the number to call to report it. Having some sort of system like that, I think many of these agencies would be more willing to participate if they have that information and it's clearly spoken to them. See Mr. Rogers there in the middle. The other group that we really have to get better at engaging our neighbors. Neighbors report very little abuse of humans. So I believe the numbers are now neighbors report 8% of domestic violence to police. They report something like 12% of child abuse. They report very little of human abuse. But when it comes to animal abuse, which is another area of my study, they report nearly 90% of animal cruelty. So neighbors continually report animal cruelty, but they are less likely to report abuse in the form of partner abuse, child abuse. A lot of things I think going on there. Just for sake of time, I won't get into detail. We know, again, there's different variables such as pets are more likely to be outside. Maybe there's greater opportunity to detect. But I think, again, it speaks to the importance of thinking, well, how do we engage neighbors? That's certainly something we want to do better at, but we at least know now they'll report animal abuse. So that means that working with animal welfare agencies in a community and them helping them understand that if someone reports animal cruelty and there's a child in the home, that it might be a good time for them to think about involving a child agency, just to, again, or the animal, even better, the animal welfare intake organization asking a question on intake and saying, hey, you're worried about pets in that home. Are there kids in the home? Do you have any fears there? And then again, you could get some information from a neighbor right away and again, direct them to the proper agency. So again, sometimes we just kind of have to, again, like I said, we have ideal hopes and then we have realistic hopes. And right now we know neighbors are willing to report animal abuse. So maybe it's time we do better about utilizing that and ensuring we know when pets are at risk, humans are too. So working and improving and strengthening those relationships, I think, is really important right now. Looking at some other effective intervention programs, again, I'm going to speak for about 10 more minutes and then maybe 15 and allow time for questions. This one program I thought was particularly interesting. It's a Baker One project in Charlotte area. It was a law enforcement initiative that partnered with law enforcement and also the legal side of things there to kind of have a more direct and dedicated approach to responding to domestic violence. They had dedicated lines, which this seems to be a common theme. Anytime I hear of a domestic violence program that's effective, such as this, is having a place where victims can always feel heard. So important. Again, when we think about abuse, it's often about control. And abusers work so hard to silence their victims that part of the healing process is being able to vocalize and to speak about the harm you experienced and to talk through those things and also to ask for help in areas that you need it. All of those things are usually shut down by perps during the process. But in this particular program, they had a non-emergent line where victims could call and report through a voicemail service there at the police station that they knew officers would be able to get the message and at least hear what was going on, get an update. Again, for emergent situations, obviously they would be calling 911 or calling in properly or appropriately. There was a zero tolerance policy in the community. Again, a partnership there with the legal aspect of cases as well, and then also just a more widespread message in the community of the zero tolerance and I think also of added surveillance and perpetrators that were deemed high risk for fatal domestic violence incidents. They observed a significant decrease in recidivism, at 99%, nearly 99% decrease. Some of the things that I'm always careful and cautious about when I see these types of studies, and again, this is not to say that this program isn't effective. I always get nervous though, sometimes as I've thought kind of more through these types of things. All we can really say is how many calls we're getting. We can't necessarily say for sure that that number is an adequate or an accurate indicator of how often these events are occurring. Particularly when we're thinking about domestic violence, if a victim stops reporting, we hope that means they're no longer being abused, but it also could mean that the abuse has gotten worse. So it's always something that I think it's always something we have to be careful and mindful of. When we stop hearing from a victim, we hope that means they've moved on to healthier and better days, and that they've come through it. But the other side of that is we've stopped hearing from them because the control has gotten worse, the abuse has gotten worse, or they feel that they weren't adequately protected the first time they trusted an agency, and so they would never trust it. They don't feel they should ever trust another one with their safety and protection. So again, pieces we need to be thinking about. I still obviously like the idea of a dedicated approach and making it very aware in the community of the importance of these issues and dealing with them appropriately. Another program is the DIVERT program out of Colorado Springs, where they kind of have a multidisciplinary group that kind of assigns a classification or risk level for different domestic violence cases that come through. Again, as I said with the law enforcement thing, this idea of continual contact seems to be very important. Helps the victim to continue to trust you, maybe for trust to grow, where they feel more comfortable to disclose things, more comfortable and likely to expect that you can be trusted and that you can help them and protect them. Phones were provided for this program if victims needed it to be able to communicate with the intake portion of these types of programs. What were the outcomes that were observed? And again, I don't know if I classified this, or I think I stopped my thought there, but they ascertained level of risk for each different type of case, also to help with prioritizing. So those deemed highest risk, again, probably got greater attention. As I said before, we can do that from an academic standpoint, but the reality is any next incident could be a fatal one. But again, when we know about certain risk factors such as strangulation and things, animal cruelty, in my mind and in my work, things such as that could indicate a greater risk, certainly we have to be mindful of that. Outcomes from a program such as this, you see the violence reduction not only for adults but for children as well. We see recidivism indicated to be reduced by perpetrators, as well as programs again try to work with perps. It's another reality that I think that we sometimes forget is, if we never work with perpetrators, they're going to continue to claim more victims than we'll ever be able to help. So it's good to invest our energy and time in working with victims and helping them to survive. I get that, certainly. But again, if we continue to ignore and don't improve our perpetrator programs, like I said, they will just continue to move from victim to victim. And no matter how many victims we help, there will always be, more as that perp continues to claim more as they're out in the community, or maybe moving to a different community and doing the same types of things and behaviors. The programs such as this often tend to strengthen relationships between disciplines, which again can be an unfortunate difficulty in many communities where we see agencies maybe not working well together. And unfortunately, the result of that is that we're less effective as we could be for victims when we don't work well together. I can think of at least a few examples and others where in studies that have looked at programs such as this, where victims say, this saved my life, and I think that's true, and it's powerful reminder of the importance of, again, prioritizing these issues, getting the right people to the table, and keeping that constant communication and contact open. Another program that one of the last ones, at least in this regard, that I want to address or note is a preschool designed specifically for children who come from homes where family violence is occurring. This particular Mi Escuelita program was out of San Diego. I think they've opened another one in Dallas, and there may be others in the country too. Just a really, I thought, innovative idea. I actually was presenting at a child welfare conference in San Diego and was able to co-present with I think it was the director, maybe founder of this group, and that's where I learned more about the program through that opportunity. But really interestingly, the school, obviously all of their staff are trauma informed, and they provide a lot of different mechanisms and ways for kids to talk about some of the abuse and harm that they've experienced. They don't, they tend to try to face it directly. They acknowledge the harm that's there, the hurt that's occurred, and then work through it. Again, we talked about, cognitive issues and learning difficulties that children from these environments can have. But again, as I said, once you're safe from abuse, I think it's possible to heal from abuse. If that safety never comes and we never reach them, we never get them out, again, very hard to ever really even think about learning it from a school setting while you're continuing to live in an abusive, high-risk environment. But a study that looked at this particular program noted that these kids went on to do as good or better than their peers in high school settings. Again, when we look at these programs dedicated specifically to kids from these type of environments and address it appropriately. We often, I think more and more we involve schools in our work in this area, but I don't think we often enough involve school bus drivers. I think they can be key too, in thinking about how do we improve our efforts. School bus drivers are often the first one to see the child after they leave their home environment, and they're the last one to see them before they go back into that home environment. So again, understanding, the way that children may not always be able to tell us what they're feeling. Sometimes they can, and sometimes they do, but they more often show us, I think, through their behaviors and actions, and helping school bus drivers understand maybe some of those warning signs, some of the things to look for in terms of behavior changes, or even just indicators of how the parents act if they see the child interacting with the parent at the bus stop. Again, I think we don't often enough include them, again, in some of these efforts, but I think there's certainly a greater role there for them. I also see faith-based organizations as having great opportunity to help. Unfortunately, many victims describe frustration and how a faith-based organization was involved in their particular case or how they responded. It doesn't mean that there aren't good ones out there, but certainly I think the opportunity is there. I can think of one study in particular that noted that it was in the, I believe it was in the Midwest, not in Indiana, but in a different state, that said, survey of domestic violence victims that said among all disciplines or among all community agencies, they would rather disclose to a pastor or church leader than any other agency in their community. So there's that opportunity there. Conversely, though, when you look at surveys of church leaders, they tend to indicate that they feel inadequately prepared to handle things such as that. And so while they would like to help with domestic violence, they don't typically, get involved in those types of things. Now, I think, again, when we're asking for involvement, we have to be careful. We have to make sure our ask is appropriate. What I tend to say when I'm working with a faith-based organization is, we're not looking for you to be detective here. We're not looking for you, if someone from your organization comes forward, discloses abuse, it's not your job to try to figure out if the abuse really happened. Do I think this is really abuse, for you to define abuse, any of those things? But rather, I think of a faith-based organization's role as being support, which should be their bread and butter anyway. You've got someone who's standing in front of you who's hurting, who's clearly, describing concerning things to you, then be there and to support them, and then ensure that they get to the proper agency that can handle the other pieces. But again, if victims are saying they would like to disclose to a church leader, then helping make sure that those in our community, faith-based organization leaders are aware of this and are adequately trained and appropriately ready to respond. Again, a big step in the right direction, particularly when we're thinking about emotional abuse and some of these things that may be more difficult to untangle and detect. I think certainly faith-based organizations, there's good opportunity there. I want to talk a little bit, when we talk about, again, working toward improving our efforts in these areas, about the child-pet bond. I've already shared a little bit about it as I've talked throughout today. My first book that I wrote was about the topic largely of the child-pet bond, and about the importance of pets to not just victims of abuse, but we even think of medical patients and those dealing with all kinds of different types of trauma and difficulty. The support that pets can provide can often be life-saving. Again, when we think of kids impacted by the issues we're describing today, many of them, I think, have pets that can play a major role in helping them. The reality is, when we think about animal welfare and child welfare, you may or may not realize this. I hear it more and more often now at different conferences that I attend or speak at, that it was actually animal welfare efforts, organized efforts, that predated child welfare efforts in the U.S. So animal welfare efforts came first. It was the work of Henry Bergh in New York there in 1866 that created the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. A major concern of his early on was horses and their upkeep and well-being there in New York. Throughout or over time, I think it was maybe 8 years later, we come to Etta Wheeler, who had reached out to Berg. She'd become very concerned about one child in particular being a victim of abuse and neglect, and the state of really for women and children, both in at that time and age, obviously was very poor, to put it mildly or put it lightly. I mean, I don't, for lack of a better way to put it, I guess poor was an understatement. But she was very concerned in particular about one child, and had reached out to Henry Berg, knowing he had success in defending and protecting animals. The two of them talked about it, and eventually would lead to the first dedicated child welfare organization in the U.S. They're out of New York 8 years after the first one to protect animals. So again, when we think about these efforts to include animal welfare, I don't necessarily see it as novel, but rather a return to our roots. It's really where we started. Animal and child groups started working together. We've kind of separated, but I think there's a lot of reason, again, to consider bringing the animal pieces back into the conversation, as well as those working in animal welfare to the table when we're looking at working with child welfare issues as well. A big reason for this is the continued study into the idea of pet attachment. Again, I've described, unfortunately, for kids in homes where partner abuse is occurring, they're unlikely to be strongly or securely attached to the abusive caregiver. And maybe their best chance at an attachment would be, again, the victimized adult. But that adult may have so little left to give that there's just little there. I think it's often the case in these homes that when there are pets there and the pets are safe and healthy and the relationship is protected, that kids instead form attachment with animals in the home. They can form strong attachment with pets. And again, obviously this is not a permanent fix. And again, it's where I talked about realistic versus ideal. Not ideal. We would want children to be strongly and securely attached to their caregivers. But again, pets can help children get through a rough time. I talked about my dog saving my life. I look back on that and I think of, he didn't just save it once in a single moment, but day after day. I would sit out there late at night and I would just cry into Shelby's fur some nights. Other nights, he would kind of stand on the edge of the yard as if to say, I've got this, take a minute. I could never put into words all the things that he did for me. I've talked with others who said, now that I've heard you speak, or I'm starting to think about my own situation, I'm realizing now how much my dog did for me. I knew he was there for me and I appreciated it, but I'm starting to understand now just how much they did. And again, I think children can form very strong attachments. Now, again, the dangerous side here is if perps start to target these pets, that emotional harm is going to be significant for children. When perps perpetrate animal cruelty, again, their thought is often, I want to create as much harm and hurt as possible. And a lot of times that means they want to make sure that the adult victim watches the children watch the pet be hurt. Again, trying to think of ways that they can create as much harm and hurt as possible, as much control. So again, anytime, whether it's kids, whether it's adults who strongly attach to animals in abusive home environments, we have to be mindful that that pet may have just become a bigger target to the perp, right? We think about abuse and perpetrators, they are working to destroy, they are working to cause chaos. They, through their acts, create stress, anxiety, fear, feelings of not being loved, unwanted, and pets are working in the opposite direction. They make you feel loved, secure, safe, consistency, all those types of things. So when the perp realizes that someone is working in the opposite direction and is counteracting everything they're doing, again, that pet can become a target real quick. And so we have to be mindful of that. But when safe, when protected, children can find help and health and relationships with animals in abusive home environments. More than just my opinion, science actually shows that dogs are awesome. In particular, one study found that pet dogs have a better are better able to mitigate the harmful effects of toxic stress for children than their parents. Another study found that among women, pets were a better mitigator, or dogs in particular, a better mitigator of harm from stress than the woman's best friend. And among married couples in the U.S., that stress or dogs are a better buffer to stress than one's partner. So again, we see all these examples from the literature and academic community showing that pets can provide a buffer. Again, it's not a fix-all, and kids will still experience hurt and harm, but having that pet that they can cling to can make a big difference. We also obviously see pets used in courtroom type settings when children are talking about difficult things, obviously. I can think of one judge who said, sometimes the kids just need to see the dog in the courtroom. Other times they actually need to be petting the dog throughout the disclosure or the testimony. Interestingly, though, again, a reminder, for these kids who are finding comfort in these dogs, this isn't their dog. This is a dog they're probably seeing possibly for the first time in that courtroom setting. and it still provides this calming influence. I think there's a lot of reasons why it makes sense. For one thing, I think of, if you've been hurt and harmed by humans, you're probably going to struggle to trust other humans. You're probably more likely to trust non-human animals, and to be able to better trust a dog or a cat, or another type of animal, that hasn't hurt you and that doesn't have this history and track record of being painful and hurtful and harmful, but rather the opposite, that has been there for you and supported you. It certainly speaks to the importance of including pets in our intervention planning. Anytime we're removing children from homes, or adults are fleeing a domestically violent home environment, always best if they can bring that pet with them. Sometimes there's difficulties to doing that. Many times there is, but when we can, it's important. If that pet was their one emotional safety, one emotional piece, keeping that with them can help them in the healing process. It can provide at least one bit of continuity in an otherwise, again, chaotic circumstances where you may be leaving your home, your school, maybe going into shelter, whatever's occurring. Having that pet that you found support from during the abuse can also be life-saving when you're receiving that same support after the abuse as you work to heal. Again, when we can keep these pairs together, it's great for both. We also know pets are probably at risk, right? If we leave them at home with the abuser in that home and we get the humans out but neglect to get the pets out, it's not going to be good. What happens to those pets generally, they may often be intentionally killed or obviously neglected, things such as that. When we think about survivors of emotional maltreatment, one of the main things that they often indicate as being critical to their surviving was this idea of unconditional positive regard. And it just seems so simple, but it's not simple. Or I mean, it is simple in a certain way, but it means so much to them. Individuals who are experiencing these types of things, just having someone show that unconditional positive regard. Now, again, when we think of kids, who may be in a healthy home environment, receiving this from someone is a nice little boost. It's a nice little bump. When we're talking about kids who live in an abusive home environment, this is an idea that may be so foreign to them. Again, this idea of someone just supporting them and being there for them. Again, it can be life-changing as well. We talk about the life, the destruction and the way abuse can destroy one's life. This is the flip side. This is how one can completely change one's life in the other way, by showing that positive, unconditional regard. It can come from a teacher, from a child services worker. It can come from a pastor or youth leader. It can come from a coach. It can come from a neighbor. It can come from a sibling or a parent or a pet. But again, having that unconditional positive regard, again, so critical. It seems simple, but it makes a huge difference. I think there's a couple of different reasons why, but the main one I'll focus on for today is, again, this idea of it gives children this idea that the normal they are seeing, the normal they are experiencing, isn't really normal. Many kids grow up in abusive home environments, and the normal they're taught is unhealthy and it's abusive. And when they are able to see this contrast that can be so critical to their health and development, that is someone else showing them the opposite of abuse, someone giving them unconditional positive regard, again, it's life altering. It allows them to see that something different is out there. It helps them to maybe not so much expect, when you live in an abusive environment as a child, you can begin to adopt this idea that abuse and harm and hurt is all I'll ever know. You become resigned to that. You may even become abusive because of that. This idea that, there's nothing better for me. But when they have someone that steps in and shows them something different, it gives them that opportunity to go on to break that cycle, to find health and healing themselves. And again, not to grow up in the same unhealthy normals that they were taught. That's one of the things I say sometimes to adults when I think about, dealing with children. How much of the healthy normal have you that you've taught your children will they have to unlearn to actually be healthy in their adult life? The things that we show our kids, the things that we tell our kids, all of these things are important. Really, probably the things we show them at times even more important than what we tell them. Again, both go hand in hand, but they are watching and they are paying attention. When they see abuse, when they begin to accept the idea that, hey, this is normal, this is how it's going to be, that's what they're more likely to continue to do. Anytime we can show that contrast and help them see, hey, it doesn't have to be like this. There's other people, there's other ways to do things. There's better and healthier ways to do things. We can go a long way to helping them, empower them to break that cycle, to recognize abuse, and again, to seek something different. For me, it was Shelby who saved my life. Again, I can think back to many different times and instances. I try, and I certainly dedicate my work to him, and I hope that he's proud of it. I never could adequately put into words. I know, particularly one time in particular when I thought I was killing myself, that my life was ending, that, you know, I look back and I know that it was always his still steady voice that talked me back. He was what kept me going, and he's the reason I'm still here. I certainly wouldn't, I don't think I'd be alive, and I certainly wouldn't be doing this work if it weren't for him. And so again, I speak often about the importance of pets because of the importance of my own to me, and all that he meant to me and all that he helped get me through. Again, not just in a single moment, but throughout the course of one's life. You know, I think we tend to believe, you know, the lie sometimes that, you know, you can't be a good dad if you didn't have a blueprint for what that should look like. And I think I believe that, and I hear many people say the same concerns. You know, and so one of the things that I've learned though is, you know, I look back to this relationship and I pull from it all the time, because I did actually have a blueprint for what a healthy relationship should look like, and it was Shelby. And I think back to the things and the attributes and the things I learned from that, when I'm thinking about my own children and the love I share with them and the relationship I have with them that I wouldn't trade for anything in this world. You know, I look back and I think, you know, Shelby certainly was there for me through the worst. And I know he has forepaws in the good of today. For me, my escape with Shelby was going for long walks. We would take long walks out in the fields there by my house. Well, it was fields at first, and it became a housing addition and golf course and other things. But just having those walks with him allowed me just time just with him, where I could just we would just escape everything, even if just briefly. I remember, you know, I had Shelby for about 17 years, and his legs on one walk just gave out, just from old age. I know no matter how long you have your pet, it's never enough, particularly when they play such a critical role in your life. But I remember that day we were walking back and his legs literally just gave out. And I remember him looking at me just so sad and scared there, laying there. And I remember, you know, I say often, you know, I picked him up and I carried him home. Just as he had carried me for so long. I can't put into words what that dog did for me. I've written a book about it if you have any interest. It's only the small portion of it talks about my own experiences with Shelby. Most of it's about my research and my work in the area of pets that I touched on briefly today. You can find it on Amazon as an ebook or a paperback copy, or really any, I think, bookstore seller. I'll share just a quick story before I wrap up here for questions. I was doing a book signing in Texas. Maybe it might have been a little over a year now ago. My daughter, you see Vera there with me. I told her that was a book giveaway, so she had come to sit there and help me. But then she looked and she saw the book and she said, "Oh, Dad, we already have this book." So she was disappointed. I have been able to find her a different book. She I guess has seen that one enough. But again, kids are awesome, and I always appreciate her support, and they certainly keep you on your toes. But again, I thank you so much for your time, for your attention today. I know it's a lot in a short period of time, but I appreciate every opportunity. You can see some different ways to reach me there. The yellow at the bottom, you can see my website. I try to make any of my at least academic published or research papers available for free through my website. So if you have interest there, you can also see different topics I speak on. Like I said, I probably have about 15 different 2-hour or more presentations on all different topics related to family violence. I speak often. I speak about 35 to 40 times a year. So certainly a passion of mine and something I enjoy doing. So again, if you have any interest in learning more, you can find that info there. I'll make my slides available as a PDF that should be going out, I think at some point here in the near future, along with a couple of the studies that I plan to share with you as well. So with that, I say thank you for your time and attention, and I'll turn it over to see if Kathy has any questions for us that people have put in the chat box.
Well, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. If no one has any questions, I wanted to thank Andrew for doing such a wonderful job presenting this important information. He gave us a lot to think about. And I also want to thank everyone that registered and attended this training. We have one more training next Friday. It's called Positive Childhood Experiences. I know maybe many of you have already registered for that, but if you haven't, or if you know others that might, please send them to our webpage. And the speaker for that one will be Roger Sherman, and he is the CEO of the PCA Idaho chapter, just like we're Indiana chapter. So that should be some really good information, something positive, I think. I also wanted to let you know that, of course, April is Child Abuse Prevention Month, and We do a lot of activities during the month of April, but really child abuse prevention should be something that we think about every day, every month, not just limited to April. But we are going to have a kickoff on April the 1st, probably about 9 o'clock in the morning. You can check our website under the events calendar and find out that information. And then we also have our major fundraising activity in April. We do a 5K run and walk, and it's on April 20th this year. When this is over, I'll be sending each of you a email with a short demographic survey that we are required to send out in order to fulfill our fundraising grant requirements. So I'll be sending out after that starting next week, the certificates for those that attended this training. But we really do appreciate everyone. And again, we thank Andrew and look for that email.
Thank you.
Thank you.